Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Tabadlab Live. This is a series of conversations that we try to have with people in leadership positions, people that are in positions of authority, people that have experienced or worked on reform or big picture change and are working on it still. One of the most challenging roles in the country right now is trying to steward the university sector or higher education at large. And the current Higher Education Commission chairperson, Dr. Tariq Banuri, has very graciously made himself available. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Tariq Banuri, the chairperson of the Higher Education Commission, to the Tabadlab Live. Thank you, Dr. Banuri, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I should be completely, I suppose, transparent and be very clear about my own view about who you are and what you represent, because I don't think a lot of people know, and you are not in the social media game or the self-promotion game, unfortunately. So a lot of people don't actually know what Dr. Tariq Banuri brings to the table. So in terms of an introduction, and I apologize if this embarrasses you a little bit, but a lot of people would not know, for example, you are an old school Pakistani civil servant who left at a very young stage in their career, but had already served in multiple positions and posts, so has a deep and abiding understanding of the country. You grew up all over the country, living in different parts of the country. You speak several of Pakistan's languages quite fluently and fluidly, and you're a native to many different parts of the country. What I, of course, found most impressive when I didn't know you was that you had a Harvard PhD, because at that time, PhDs and Harvard were the two pinnacles of education and where to go for an education. You're a Harvard-trained economist. You've served at the highest level in the United Nations system. You were a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for the work that you've done on climate change globally. You've headed organizations in multiple locations in Thailand. You were based there, heading up a think tank there for many years, in Stockholm, in Boston, in Cambridge, where you also went to school. At the UN, you were working in New York, but had a role that was looking at most of the world in terms of sustainable development. And your most recent role was at the University of Utah. The one thing that gets ignored in all this, of course, is that pretty much all of our environmental legislation was, at least in part, owing itself to the work that you did in the late 80s and early 90s. You were heavily involved in the Rio Summit. You helped, in fact, you founded the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. So I don't think it would be unfair, and I don't think I'm breaking any privilege by saying that, for example, if there was no Tariq Banuri, I know for a fact there would be no Musharraf Zaidi, but that's not such a big deal. There would definitely be no Dr. Adil Najam. There's a lot of names I can take. I take Adil's because I know that he's as open about what many of us owe to you in terms of our career and our learning and who we are and the access to wisdom that we've had over the years. One of the reasons I was really excited about you becoming Higher Education Commission is that this is the kind of role in which, rather than you being a privilege for a very few, couple of whom I've named, there's dozens of people. Anybody that's ever worked at SDPI owes their career path, at least in part, to you. And I know that Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, Dr. Sabah Gul Khatak, Dr. Sharaf Rafi Khan, none of them would hesitate in acknowledging what I've said about you from my perspective or from Adil's. But one of the reasons I was really excited that you were the new chairperson of the Higher Education Commission is that I thought this is a chance for every university student in the country to have at least a part of that experience of working with you or working under your guidance and being shaped essentially by the decisions and the stewardship that you've taken on. So that's the good part. In late February, the world was hit with COVID, and I think every organization and every individual in any position of responsibility struggled with that. So the purpose of today's conversation is obviously to talk a little bit about how you were trying to manage things during a time of COVID, but I also wanted to make sure that we got to know you a little bit better and maybe start off with talking about why I understand why I was interested in you being HEC chairperson, but talk a little bit about why this role was of interest to you after everything that you've achieved, alhamdulillah. Why come and take a role like this?
You know, when I was selected for this position, I talked to my wife, and I said, "Well, what do you think? Should I go ahead with this?" Going to be a huge cut in salary for you. So she said, "Okay, हम दोबारा से गरीब हो जाएंगे." But the main thing is that if you get offered this position, you cannot say no. This is really something which will shape the future of our country. And anybody who is given a chance to shape the future of the country simply cannot say no. So I think that's the reason why I was happy to accept this position. I do think that things in the higher education sector improved significantly after the HEC was set up. The number of students who now are able to enter into higher education has increased dramatically. It's approximately 10 times what it used to be before HEC was there. The proportion of students for whom there is a seat in any higher education institution has increased at least fourfold. Number of research papers, number of faculty members, number of universities, all of these things have increased. But I think a lot of us, including myself, were very concerned that the quality has at least not kept pace with the quantitative changes. And by some reckoning, it has also declined. And that is really a matter of tremendous concern. One thing I should mention, which was also a factor when I was taking this position, there's a recent report by the World Bank called Pakistan at 100. In 2047, which is 27 years from now, Pakistan will reach the age of 100. And they were trying to project, do scenarios of what it would look like. And although they had a lot of other factors, industry, commerce, trade, etc., they had two major scenarios. The positive scenario was one in which Pakistan became more progressive, more prosperous, successful country. And then there was a business as usual scenario, which basically said, more or less things will continue the way they are. And the interesting thing was that the only difference, fundamental difference between these two scenarios was that in one, there was a huge investment in human capital, in learning, in education. And the other one, where this investment in all of these sectors was as per business as usual. So I think that if we think about the future of the country, it depends critically on this. It does not depend upon it, and obviously it depends upon your roads and your infrastructure and so forth. But fundamentally, what it depends upon is the quality of the human beings that we will have, whether we are able to solve problems for ourselves, for the rest of the world, whether we are able to produce, whether we are able to live peacefully with each other, peacefully with our neighbors. All of these things are going to make a difference. And that's what the education sector is about. And that's why I'm here.
Sure. This is not the first time, of course, that you've had the chance to tackle higher education. Again, something that, I think people who follow this closely would know, but a lot of folks wouldn't. There used to be something called the University Grants Commission until about 2002. That was the governing body, the regulatory instrument that the government used for higher education. But there were a couple of key sort of challenges with it. One is it was just a post office. It essentially was a pass-through mechanism for money and for government edicts. It certainly had very little to do in terms of its control or contribution to quality or to student welfare. There were also a lot of questions about the way universities were governed before 2002. And the Higher Education Commission was in many ways an instrument, kind of an omnibus legislation that was going to fix the regulatory part of the equation from a top-down perspective or a central perspective, but also encourage universities to be governed in a fundamentally different way, partly through regulatory exercise of authority in terms of how VCs are selected and what kinds of pay packages were on offer, what kind of career paths were on offer. All of that was something that was decided through a body called the Steering Committee on Higher Education. That's a time at which I had the chance to work for you, Tariq, and for the steering committee itself. And many people who are well known today, including Dr. Shuthasan and many others, were part of that committee. That committee was chaired, of course, by Dr. Ataur Rahman and by Dr. Shams Qasim Laka jointly. Shams Qasim Laka being the founding president of the AKU. When you took this role, I felt that there was at least part of the agenda of the Steering Committee on Higher Education that kind of was still unfulfilled. And that's not because of anything that was wrong with any of the previous chairpersons or with HEC. I mean, the HEC, of course, has weaknesses even today under your sort of leadership. But the point being that there was elements of the SCHE design and thinking when the HEC was conceived that haven't really panned out in the way that perhaps we talked about they might back in 2000, 2001, 2002. You want to talk a little bit about that process and how where we are today sort of needs to connect to that original sort of intent or vision?
Well, one correction, Ataur Rahman had nothing to do with the Steering Committee on Higher Education. It was Shams Laka, he was the chairman.
Sure.
And of course, we had a very high-level group of members. The late Dr. Riazuddin was a member. Ishrat Hussain, of course, is a member. Suhail Naqvi was a member. But to go back to it, the way we had looked at the higher education challenge was as a kind of a four-dimensional problem. 4 dimensions being that one, that the structure of institutions should be one which gives people the incentive to make the right decisions, etc., etc. So the issue of how the institutions need to be structured, which is kind of the regulatory part of things. The second part of it, of course, was funding. That funding for higher education had been limited, and that had, of course, limited the sector. Part number 3 was capacity building, that people needed to learn new things and even to learn to do things in better ways, and that should be a continuous process of capacity building. And part number 4 was leadership, that the leadership has to be one which was committed to excellence and was able to drive the system to excellence. Now, when HEC got set up, it did undertake a lot of these functions, but I think some of them got done in a somewhat superficial manner, and therefore did not produce the results that we had expected. The issue of leadership, our idea was to that the leadership of universities would be selected through more merit-based mechanisms, and that there would be a system of grooming the leadership as they came up the ranks, and therefore would be able to discharge those responsibilities. None of those things got done. The same kind of a patronage system continued to operate, and that was a rather unfortunate turn of events. The capacity building part was done kind of superficially. Some training programs were organized, but really the commitment to excellence was not there. Funding, of course, was the great success story of the HEC. In the early years, funding was increased absolutely dramatically, unprecedented increase in funding. But most of it was wasted. I think there are lots of huge white elephant products which did not produce the results. But of course, when you have so much more money, a lot of the positive impacts also came through. And the institutional structures to give people the right incentives were also developed in a somewhat haphazard manner. I think right now, as we are looking at some of the rules, the regulations, we find that things are in such a, there's so much confusion, there's so much inconsistency. The rules have been prepared in a rather ad hoc fashion. There have been ad hoc changes in the rules. One of the results is that they lead to lots of litigation. If the rule is not clear, it gives people a lot of leeway. Then it also creates potential for conflict, and we have thousands of cases lying before the courts in various parts because of challenges that are given. So, I mean, if I look at all the four dimensions that we in the steering committee were trying to put forward, to be fair, I can say that we made some progress on each one, but the way in which it needed to be done in a properly structured and really incentive-based manner did not happen. So the result is that we've had huge improvements on the quantitative side, but on the quality issues, on relevance issues, we have had lots of difficulties. So when I came in, one of my concerns was to re-establish, number one, the priority for quality and for relevance of education and research in the country. And number two, to make sure that the systems, whatever is done with the idea of quality and excellence in mind. It should not be done simply for the sake of doing something. It should be done with a proper, thorough analysis of why it is being done and how it can be done in order to ensure quality. So those are the dimensions that we're trying to look at.
So you just mentioned, that's fantastic, and I mean, I'm reminded of so many of the conversations where I think a lot of the effort from the technocratic side or the technical side was to get people to focus on the substance of the argument. For example, on the issue of structure or institutional dynamic, what we were really talking about back in that day was the governance of these universities. And the easiest way for a lot of people to understand that would be, basic principles of corporate governance. The people that are in charge at a macro level can't be the ones holding themselves to account at the micro managerial level. So basic sort of corporate governance. That's where discussions about university senates and syndicates were really, I think elemental. But that's also where so many of the teachers' unions, I mean, FAPWASA in Peshawar, there was the PUTA in, there was, obviously political party affiliated organizations, teachers and professors. And that negotiation process, I think, took away a lot of the energy in terms of the white hot core of the substance that you and Dr. Shams Qasim Laka in particular, but the entire SCHE and the government at that time wanted to focus on. But of course, I think that's also par for the course. And in the last 2 years, with your role as the chairperson of higher education, I'm sure you would agree that so much of what you need to do is needs to be couched or needs to be processed through a political lens, and that's not always easy for somebody, for anybody that's minded to focus on substance. But in many ways, if you aren't careful, then that political system or process or dynamic ends up consuming whatever strategy or plans that you might have. Is that an unfair characterization of what you've had to deal with in the past couple of years? Or, I mean, I guess there's a number of questions about your role so far that I would have, and that I think people would be interested in hearing your own assessment on. One is just generally the progress you've made from the day you joined to where you are today. How much of a step forward do you think you've been able to achieve at the HEC? And then really questions about whether you find the system to be in any way supportive of the kinds of reforms and changes that you want to bring about.
Well, in the last 2 years, we have opened a number of fronts, and I think if I were a politician, I would not do it. I would do it one step at a time. But not being a politician, we have basically approached it in the manner of, well, here's the problem, let's try to solve that problem. And there are a number of challenges that we are looking at. Probably the best way of doing it is, just to go down step by step. The quality of our educational programs is not something that has been given enough attention in the past. Curriculums are outdated, not really prepared thoroughly or properly. And more importantly, the capacity for devising curriculum has not been devolved to the extent it needs to be devolved. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not something that HEC needs to be doing. It's the universities, the professors, the faculty members. But there, the process has been rather slow. Even the curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum, I think we've never had until now a proper look at it as to what we are trying to achieve through this curriculum. This idea that the undergraduate degree has to be a terminal degree. That means once you get this degree, it should be enough for almost everybody, except for those who really want to do something out of the goodness of their heart. That it has to be a terminal degree is really not sunk in. People sort of pursue lots of degrees, almost for remedial purposes. That the undergraduate wasn't good enough, so let me do this master's or that master's. So we have revamped the entire undergraduate curriculum. We are revamping the entire PhD curriculum. Even the basic conception of what a PhD program is about has not really sunk in. The quality of both the undergraduate and the graduate programs, when you look at the graduates and you talk to them, you find huge challenges. I mean, I'll give you one example. We had an intake right now for future faculty members, people with PhDs. And there were lots of interesting questions there. But one interesting question was very simply this. We asked people, please name a book that you've read in the last 12 months. Half of the people left that question blank. They got 0 on that question. Everybody knows that, you get graded for every single question. They got 0 on that question because they could not even mention one book that they had read in the last 12 months. Of the remaining people, the most popular choice were 2 books that had been written 30 years ago. One of them is The Alchemist, which of course people did not give us the correct name. They didn't say The Alchemist, they said Alchemist. And the other is Shahabnama by Qudatullah Shah, both of which were written in the 1980s. So, it's a surprising thing that people who are doing PhDs, when asked to name a book, are either unable to mention anything, or if they do mention, it is something that was written 30 years ago. People are not, this idea that you have to keep up, you have to keep on learning is simply not there. So one of the things is transforming the education system, making it more quality oriented, and using that in a backwards manner also to then work with the faculty to bring the faculty on board so that they are much more committed to providing excellent education. The idea that there is something called effective teaching, that professors have a responsibility to learn what effective teaching is. That idea has not quite sunk in. And we find huge problems when we look at the quality of teaching in the country. And by the way, COVID has actually thrown that up much more in starker relief than it had in the past. The research program, the number of papers supposedly in peer-reviewed journals has increased by a factor of 15. But when we actually talk to our government, our business, nobody seems to know about it. What is the impact? Have our policies improved as a result? Have our practices improved as a result? Has our business become more profitable? Have our exports increased? Has our agriculture become more profitable, more productive? The answer when you talk to the people in the field is they either don't know about it or maybe they are pessimistic about it. So this idea that the research has to be oriented towards producing results, and people have found ways of gaming that system, right? So, your students write a paper, you force them to put your name on it, turns out you become one of the most productive people just because you have a lab, and anybody who writes that a paper is forced to put their names on it. I mean, these are not things that should be done in any respectable set of institutions. So we have transformed the research system. Then the system of training of faculty members was almost non-existent. We had a number of desultory training programs. We looked at those training programs. They were actually worsening the outcomes. That means if somebody came into a program with certain level of skills, when they went out, they would have lower skills as a result of that program.
And you put together now, just talk a little bit about how you've consolidated what was happening before and what you're trying to do to renew the capability on that front.
Yeah, so we have set up a new, it's not a new institution. It used to exist in the UGC days, was shut down. So we've revived it, the National Academy of Higher Education, with a very dynamic rector, with the idea of setting up programs for faculty members, for future leadership of universities, also for university staff, and people who are otherwise affiliated with universities. So we have set up an institutional structure which would provide training. But the main thing is training can be provided even without an institution. Our purpose is to actually focus on the quality of training, to have an institution which is accountable to us for providing quality training, number one. And number two, to involve them in the continuous professional development of the faculty members. That means, in other words, use them as a vehicle for creating a national community which is committed to excellence. So it's not only that they bring you in, give you training, and then let you loose upon the world. They actually are supposed to keep you together as a community, to interact with each other, and to help you as you move forward into the profession, so that you become successful in future life.
And how satisfied are you, Tariq, with the current status of the newly renewed NAHI?
Well, they've just finished one very good program. I mean, we were, like everybody else in the country, we were handicapped by the fact that it is an online program because of COVID-19. But I think they have accomplished two things. One is, the main thing is that in that program, there's a lot of interactive features. So it's not only that people need to cerebrally learn something, they have to practice things, they have to internalize things. It has to become a part of their practice, and that requires interactivity. But what we asked them to do was to now use the internet as a way of creating those kind of interactive features. And I think they have been quite successful in doing it. But more importantly, I think what they have done is to show us also an example of how online teaching can be done properly. So as opposed to a lot of the programs, which online programs done by universities, which are generating a huge degree of unrest and disaffection among the student, this is one in which it's been universally appreciated. I think they've done a very fine job in doing it. Now, it's very early to say. One swallow doesn't make a summer. This is just the first program that they have done. But I think they've produced a good start, and I'm confident that they will build upon this one.
So Tariq, you've mentioned something, and I wanted to move to COVID-19 and the various challenges in a very structured way. But since you've brought up the unrest, I think this is as good a time as any for us to maybe jump into that a little bit. One of the privately, perhaps it should stay private, but since we're having the chat, one of the concerns that I see around social media and in terms of conversations that young people are having is that sense of unrest or unhappiness. It's very clearly there. Now, I don't doubt that there is a percentage or a fraction among that discontent that is what you might call gamesmanship, that isn't really actual sincere students who are genuinely troubled. It's troublemakers. I was a troublemaker at school and in university, so I kind of know the type. But I also know that I was the 15% at best. and that most students actually have genuine and legitimate concerns. I also think that the troublemakers are usually the ones you want to work on a little bit, because they might have greater potential in some areas than others. But really, how do you react, to when you learn that there's this disaffection or discontent, and to what extent do you feel that the HEC's job is to address that discontent?
Well, my view about this is that yes, it's the HEC's job, but it's also the job of the universities, the faculty members, and even the discontented people to address the discontent. It's almost like some people have used the metaphor of a war, that this is a war. Here is a invisible enemy that has attacked us, and not only is it attacking us by killing people and by disabling people, it has actually disabled all of the things which we need to be able to respond to it. Our industry has to be shut down, business has to be shut down, our education institutions have to be shut down, everything has to be shut down. And we now need not only to protect ourselves against this enemy, but we also need to work in a way to reestablish and rebuild our systems. Now, this is a common a common endeavor. All of us have to do this together. So my view from the first day has been that we are now in this totally unprecedented situation. Under this situation, it will be very difficult, at least in the short term, and perhaps even in the longer term, one never knows, for universities to function in the way they have been used to functioning. And we have to find alternative ways of functioning very, very quickly. It's not going to be easy because nobody is used to these alternative ways of functioning. Even those of us who are generally more comfortable with the digital domain, even we find difficulty in dealing with this. I think in HEC, we have been doing all of our meetings online for a very long time. And yet, when we were forced to shift everything online, we found that we still had a lot of difficulties to deal with, because previously it was a combination, these were hybrid things, and also we were using one particular technology. It wasn't the greatest technology, but it seems to work for us. Now we're using other technologies, and every single thing we have to learn, because sometimes things break down, sometimes you don't hear people, sometimes what you need in terms of making those systems work are not there. So for us, the challenge was, yes, we know nobody is prepared. We have to help them prepare. We have to make sure that people prepare. And we have to...
challenges there. Sorry, Tariq. Go ahead. Finish that thought.
No, so we have to bring people up to par.
Yeah.
So from HEC side, what we have done is we've actually, taken that entire huge problem that we now confront and try to break it down into pieces. Okay, here is one area. This is what we need to do. It's not going to be perfect, but this is the first step you need to take. Just to give you one example, none of our faculty members are actually trained in online teaching. If you look at any of the online courses that are being offered by Pakistani professors in Pakistan, they are kind of very mediocre at best. We were not prepared for it. So we know that this is going to take a long time. But the first thing we did was we collected a few courses. We said, these are the courses you can take. You can just go to the internet and take those courses. Yesterday, I got the data. 23,556 faculty members have taken those courses simply in order to teach themselves how to teach online. Now, the main thing about this is that you can say, well, maybe they didn't learn enough. Maybe they still have a long way to go. And yes, we are now monitoring the situation, asking them to do other things. But you have to take a problem which appears to be intractable, break it down, and then find people the steps. You take this step, then we'll see another problem, then you take the next step, etc., etc.
So I just want you to clarify, because that's a really impressive number. I would say it's newsworthy. You're saying since the beginning of the COVID crisis, we've had over 23,000 public sector university teachers take online courses that the HEC arranged to enable them to be better tooled, better equipped, and more capable of offering online instruction?
That's right. No, HEC did not arrange it.
Okay.
Because we thought that there was no reason to reinvent the wheel. These courses are already there.
Okay.
They're sitting on the internet,
Okay.
on YouTube or other channels. We selected the ones that we thought were the best, and we made them available. We told we gave the links to the universities and said, please ask.
You created the content for them.
We created an archive, and we said, please go ahead and ask your faculty members to take those courses. They don't know what is involved, and they are thinking about it in the way that you think about a normal course. This is not a normal course. You have to think differently about it. So take those courses. 23,556, that was the number I got yesterday. So, so the main thing is, you see, what we did in terms of this is we divided it up into 8 categories. Faculty preparedness is this one category that I've mentioned. In each one, we said, this is a challenge, this is a target, these are the steps you need to take in order to move towards that target, right? So a learning management system, see, a university doesn't have the capacity to manage online courses. So we said, well, you have to have a decision-making system. Can we put this course online? Can we not put this course online? You have to assign the responsibility to somebody. You have to have an evaluation system. You have to have a grievance redressal system. And you have to have an electronic learning management system in which those courses can be registered. Now, it turned out the majority of the universities didn't have it. Now we have gotten the report that close to 78%. I think the number is 78%. 78% of the universities now have those systems. Those that didn't, we helped them get those systems in place. We also we got the system which are open source. We set them up for them, but we also encourage them to look at other custom-based solutions. And so some of them have gone for the custom-based solution, etc. So university readiness. Can it make a decision? Can it decide whether this course is ready for being offered? Is one issue. The course readiness is another issue. Most courses are not designed to be taught online. We haven't made that much of a progress there, but we have transformed some of the courses into online ready courses. And basically what that means is that an online course has to have a lot of the content which otherwise, even it's good practice to have otherwise also, but sometimes you can overcome it through your interactive interaction with the students. But for online, you need it beforehand. So we've given clear instructions. This is what you need to do, have a course online ready. Technology, do they have Zoom? Do they have MS Teams? Do they have any other forms of interaction with students? Have they created those apps? Have they given them to the students? Have they given them to faculty members? Do the libraries have the capacity to be able to provide you the information about the books that you need or the journals that you need, etc.? So each one of them, we took the target, we said, this is what you need to do, and this is the first step. And what we've gotten is we have a compliance rate of about 80%. It's higher in some cases, lower in some cases, but it's 80% across the board by the 31st of May.
So I have a question on all of this, because in a sense, it sounds like you've responded to COVID-19. I don't think the outside world, and this is my sort of layperson's view, but I don't think people outside, I would actually argue even people in government actually don't have any idea of how much work you've done to kind of prepare the system. So I think one, if I was advising you, which I'm not, but if I was, I would say, I think that story needs to be told a little bit, because the other parts of the story, which are also quite legitimate, I genuinely think that there are thousands of students that have legitimate concerns and quarrels with the system, but the counterfactual of what has gone on isn't out there. Let's park that for a moment, and I want to come back to that. But I wanted to ask you to maybe explore or give your own sense of the degree of openness to change. Because in a sense, if I'd asked you this pre-COVID, I would have been asking you to make a value judgment as the chairperson HEC. But now you're not just the chairperson HEC, you're also in a sense the lead coordinator for the higher education response to COVID-19. And so in a very small window and in very specific ways, you're getting to see the system react to stimulus, to information and requests for action. And I wanted you to make maybe talk about 3 layers of response. The first is the responsiveness of students. Notwithstanding their quarrels, I want to hear your take on how students have reacted to this. And you can include numerical sort of estimates if you like. The second is the universities. Which universities are outstanding? Which are laggards, if you want to mention them? But is there a clear and key distinction between public and private on that front? And then finally, maybe most importantly, the degree of responsiveness to the needs of students and the HEC and universities when it comes to the government itself. And obviously, there I'm talking not just about procedural or regulatory support in terms of coordination or whatnot, but also in terms of the quantum of funding maybe, or the speed at which releases are made and those sorts of things.
Well, the thing is that I actually don't think that we really have a problem of a huge amount of resistance. It sort of flares up from time to time. And they're generally the usual kind of reasons for it. People are comfortable acting in particular ways. They don't want to act differently. I mean, there's a kind of a comfort level in the familiar things. For actually asking faculty members to do something different, I mean, they are well respected in the community. They're doing things in a particular way. Why should anybody question whether what they're doing is right or not? The same thing is for the vice chancellors. They also, the vice chancellor is really a very, very important, extremely respectable position, and here we are questioning their legitimacy. I think as far as the students are concerned, they have been by and large not very engaged in this process. I have, on every occasion that I've gotten the chance of visiting a university, I've tried to talk to the students directly. It's not been easy, I have to tell you this, because the vice chancellors don't want people to talk to the students directly for fear that some of the internal problems might get revealed. But the better vice chancellors were more open. They did want to create those opportunities. So I did speak with speak to the students directly, but I did not feel that it was. I mean, I felt that people were kind of moved by it, but I did not feel that there was a great deal of engagement. That people actually thought this is really about us. This is something that we need to be doing. I mean, at the end of the day, everything that we are doing is about the students, right? If the quality of our degrees is better, they will get better jobs. If the quality of the education is better, they will be successful in their careers. That is really why we are trying to do this. But yet, there's a kind of passivity, except for things which are perhaps not that important, or perhaps even may affect the conditions a little bit differently. In the faculty also, I think by and large, I found the same thing, that people were supportive. The only opposition I find in the faculty is some faculty members, perhaps a small minority. There is something in Pakistan which one can call the myth of Pakistani inferiority. It's a very common myth. A lot of people feel that... I'm sorry? Say that again.
Sir, ye Pakistan, yahan pe to it's very hard to do this. This is not.
Ye Pakistan hai, yahan pe ye nahi ho sakta. Yahan pe ye nahi ho sakta. This myth of Pakistani inferiority is extremely debilitating. You ask people.
It's infuriating.
You ask people, here are things. It's not rocket science. Let's do them. This is a way of improving our system. This is a way of actually running things better. No, we can't do it because this is Pakistan. And the implication is that Pakistani, by somehow, people seem to imply that Pakistanis are inferior people. I don't believe it. I think Pakistanis are the most brilliant people that I've met. They can solve any problems that we put to them, provided that we overcome these mental blinders. So I do find the myth of Pakistani inferiority being thrown into my face now and then, but it's a very small minority of people who do that. In the students, I mean, if I look at the COVID situation, in the COVID situation, there are a number of extremely legitimate issues. About 10% of the people literally do not have access. Either they don't have internet connections, or the internet connections are so bad as to be almost non-existent, or they don't have devices, etc. It ranges in different universities. It ranges from about 7% to about 15%. So I use a ballpark figure of about 10%. Roughly 90% of them have some device and have at least a 2G, if not a 3G connection, but they don't have the bandwidth to actually be able to use it properly. So what we have tried to do is to look at it, with regard to solving the problems of different groups. The ones who don't have it, for them, we need money. So we've asked the government to provide some kind of a package in which we will be able to create a potential for them to be able to access it, or maybe to bring them back on campus even during the lockdown, so that they can begin to access some of these things. So we are negotiating with the government on this. For the others, it's really a question of getting them the appropriate data package and making sure, A, that the teachers know how to teach, and B, that they use apps which are appropriate for mobile internet, because only about 30 to 40% have fixed line internet. The rest of them have mobile internet. So we are trying to shift people back to mobile internet. And we know that there are some people who would never be satisfied, but those are not the ones that I think about. The ones I think about is the ones who have a legitimate problem, and it's a problem that we can solve. And we've, again, tried to divide that problem into a number of things: device, internet access. If you're in the region where there is no access, how do we get that? If you're in the region where there is access, how can we get you the appropriate package? Making the medium, the content correspond to the medium. Make sure that if you have this kind of an internet connection, then the app is capable of supporting it. And then also training teachers how to use this medium properly. So that's the way in which we are going. The universities also have done surveys, and again, nobody is happy with this. I'm not very happy with this, but I think people are anywhere ranging from about 64% to about 90% of the people express a degree of, yes, it's difficult, but we are managing. About 10% of the people either feel that they don't have access, or they cannot manage.
So I think that's really well explained. Now I have a question that maybe is a little bit harder, and maybe perhaps a little bit borderline, a little bit unfair. We talked about the degree to which the government itself is responsive in terms of the needs of students. We talked about the students themselves. We talked about vice chancellors, the universities, and faculty. And you described a number of things you're doing to try and address the legitimate concerns of people. One of the other big questions is the degree to which the HEC itself is capable of dealing with this challenge, the kind of team that you have, or in the case of the executive director position that you don't have, and unfortunately haven't had right from the start. Do you want to address kind of concerns that people have, that despite your own clear vision and quite brilliant vision for what you want to do, the ability that you have to do it will hinge very heavily on the kind of team you have at the HEC, and there I think there are questions about what you have available.
Well, I mean, I have kind of three different approaches to this issue. In the first instance, I should say, and that's my first response to this question. In the first instance, I actually think that 90% of what we are talking about is teachable. So I actually treat it as a teachability problem, right? People are in a system. They've spent 10, 15, 20, even longer years in a particular environment in which we haven't asked them to pursue excellence. And the moment you come in,
Alex, sorry to cut you off. Obviously, we haven't asked them to pursue excellence because I don't know of any organization that has people that stay for 20 years in which there is a culture of excellence. Cultures of excellence, by very definition, have a degree of turnover which is higher than average. That's how
Yeah,
you create excellence.
be that as it may, I mean, one can keep an open mind on this. I think that uh, the um, you know, if you look at an environment in which the number of institutions that are committed to excellence are limited, then there is also an incentive to stay in one place where you think that you can make a contribution. So I think it can go either way. But the real issue is that if you have people who are there who have never been asked to do something, and then you come in and you want to ask them that question, even if they are very good people, it will take them a while to retool themselves. And yes, there are a few good people, or maybe a significant number of good people who are capable of responding to incentive or teaching themselves or being taught. And so one of my first task is to encourage people on the basis of their ability to respond to this challenge. So that's question number one. It's how the system itself uh, uh, sort of brings out the excellence in people. Part two, of course, is that this has not been created by accident, right? This is it's part of the myth of Pakistani inferiority. This kind of a commitment to mediocrity, as it were, has been created structurally. And it has been created by both a commitment to saying that, in ye Pakistan hai, yahan pe yahi ho sakta hai. This is what is possible in Pakistan. So, how do we reorient ourselves, including how do we reorient our recruitment systems, our promotion systems, and our advancement systems. So our recruitment and promotion systems are also extremely problematic. Unfortunately, those are also systems in which there are, they confer rights on people. So it's not easy to transform them overnight. And also, one doesn't want to do those things in a half-baked fashion. So we have been tinkering away at the edges of this system in order to be able to transform it. And I think what we have tried to do in the meantime is to create islands. So if there is if the structural solution is not possible, you pick out the ones which are of critical importance and you try to infuse in them a slightly different way of operations. So we have also tried to create islands. In HEC, one of the advantages we had is that a lot of the senior positions were unfilled. So we have tried to sort of fill in the senior positions with people who might be much more committed to excellence and might have much more experience in doing it. I just mentioned Nahi as an example, that we were able to bring somebody in from outside who seems to have done a good job in the beginning, and we hope that will continue to do a good job as we move forward. Similarly, in other areas, we've tried to bring in people from outside. And then the final thing is to actually, um, you know, uh, sort of weave it into the larger problem of institutional reform in the education sector itself. See, because part of our problem is that, HEC, the current structure was built up, almost in its own right. So I don't have. When I first started working at HEC, we did not have a lot of people who had really years of experience at different levels in the higher education system. People who have actually taught courses, known what it is to develop a curriculum, tried to experiment with different ways of teaching, even people who are doing sort of research, active in research and trying to produce results. So we did not have a lot of those, so it had very early on become an internal bureaucracy. And, off and on, people would sort of bring in people on deputation, but it was not a well integrated system. So my last concern is how do we integrate HEC with the education system itself. As we transform the larger education system, we also transform HEC in the process. So we have a kind of a three-way approach in doing it. The short-run approach is what we have done, try to create islands of excellence and then move forward.
So Tariq, obviously this raises challenges for your vision and how you're going to execute it, because you essentially are dealing with, and these might be words that are too harsh, but they're my words, and I take full ownership of them. When you have insular government structures that are more fixated on process, and for good reason as well. It's money, and it's a public interest. It has to be protected, at least in part for good reason. But when you have that insularity, then the hope or the possibility of connecting with what is clearly a very different dynamic in terms of student. I was thinking about when I was a student, and I mentioned earlier, being a troublemaker essentially meant challenging the vice chancellor once in a while. Speaking up in class, maybe out of turn, and those sorts of things. When that happens today, depending on the moment, one student's sort of letter of rustication, which I saw online today, could become a national news story. And so the HEC's ability to connect with that discourse and to in a sense, feed that monster, because I think one of the things that a lot of certainly Gen Xers, definitely boomers, and I think even some millennials really struggle with generationally is the pace and the expectations of young people today. I think every young person today, because they were born into Facebook and Twitter, and they were born into digital nativity, if you will, they think that voice, and they may be right, I don't mean this pejoratively, but they think that their voice really matters. And I think for a lot of us, I'm sort of born in the 70s. For a lot of us, we think even our voice, even with quite a lot of stature and pomp about us, or some of us, actually doesn't matter that much. So I think that differential in how Pakistani students see their voice, how impatient they are, I think quite rightly, with a system that doesn't quite cater to them all the way, and in many cases doesn't cater to them at all. How do you deal with that delta? You have a system that is stuck in maybe the 80s or 90s, even though it was set up in 2002, and you have children who were born in the 2000s who are now coming up and demanding rights, which I think they're fully entitled to demand. How do you bridge the gap?
Well, you see, there are two. One has to divide it into two parts. Part number one is that I wish that people were demanding more rights with regard to how things are going on normally. Part two is how do people respond to any kind of a change? Now, the thing is that as far as part one is concerned, I do wish that there would be more of a response. I'll give you an example. When I first took over, there is something called attestation. Every student needs to get their degree attested. It's a hugely inconvenient process, completely insensitive to student needs, etc., and unnecessarily so. But luckily, we had a fairly good person who was leading that process, and we, worked together on this to try to simplify, to try to ease up. And so people were generally their life became much easier as a result. And now we have almost completely gone on to online systems. Now, the thing is that you actually found that the unhappiness was with that, with a very inconvenient system, was very low. Now, I felt unhappy with it because I saw a long line of people standing there, and I thought, why are we bothering these people? But the students themselves thought it as, well, gee, this is how life is. And now that thing is gone, I think if somehow or the other there's an attempt to bring back that system, I think people will be extremely reactive and would not want it to come back. So, I think what I'm trying to say is that there was a kind of a low-level equilibrium trap in which people were comfortable. They had found their level of comfort, and that was not really creating the hassles. My concern actually is that low-level equilibrium trap is not in the interest of students or of the country, and that needs to be changed. Now, the problem is that when you try to change it, there will be things which affect you negatively. And there's it creates a huge uproar as a result. I think what is happening in COVID is a unique case because it's not something that we try to change, although we would have tried to introduce more online education down the line, but we didn't try to change it, but it was forced upon us. But nevertheless, because it forced people to do differently, the reaction to it was much more strident than if we had wanted people to continue to do whatever they were doing. Right? So I think we need to distinguish between these two. As far as the way things are going, they may be very bad, but people have gotten used to it and they're quite comfortable. This is the rut out of which we want to pull the education system out, and it will create problems. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but that's
clearly not. Look, Dr. Sab, you've taken out an enormous amount of time. This is usually, we try to keep it between 30 minutes and an hour. I fully feel we could go for at least another couple of hours with, and in some ways, we barely touch the surface of some things. I do want to end on what I hope is an optimistic note, but what I fear might be a pessimistic one. The budget is coming up, I think later this week, it'll be announced. I feel like quite rightly, as you said at the top of the conversation, this is a time where the system needs to double down and invest even more in something like higher education than it has before. And of course, you would obviously feel the same way, given your position, but also given your lifetime's work. How likely do you think it is that you will have any kind of favorable consideration when the budget is announced? And if, given what some of us at least are really worried about vis-a-vis a pensions crisis, especially at universities, and more largely a public sector salaries crisis, especially at universities, if there isn't that leeway. So I guess a two-part question. One, do you think there'll be enough money? But two, even if there isn't most of it going to get spent on potentially a salary increase or pension increases instead of on the capital investments that need to be addressed?
Well, I mean, there are three things here. One is that I am actually quite surprised that notwithstanding the commitment of this government to education and higher education in particular, I think the Prime Minister is genuine when he says that this is a high priority. The Minister of Education, we have a very good person. So I don't think that we have any difficulties in that score. Minister of Planning is generally very, very supportive. But the funding situation is the worst it has ever been in our entire history. It is the worst it has ever been in our entire history. And this is something that does need to be corrected because it's really digging the grave of the country, not only of the education system, but of the country as a whole. Last year, the budget was cut, slashed. This year also, there's a nominal increase, but very, very little. And so we will continue to struggle. That's number one. The second point, there are two other points that we need to keep in mind with regard to this, and also with regard to the question that you asked. Pakistan is one of the most competitive countries when it comes to providing education. Our public sector universities, the average cost of teaching a student for 1 year is about 160, 170, but roughly $1,000, 170,000 rupees per student per year. Now, $1,000 per student per year is lower than any other country that I've been able to look at. That means we are actually doing something more competitive. And it's not that, we are doing a worse job than some of other Asian or African countries. Maybe we're doing a worse job compared to European countries, but we are definitely not doing a worse job compared to most of our people in similar income brackets. And nevertheless, we provide a decent, acceptable quality of education, shall we say. The government provides only about 50,000 out of the 170-odd thousand. The rest of it they raise through tuition and other resources. The bulk of it does go to paying the professors, and in some cases the sunk cost. The pension is a sunk cost; you have to pay it. It's a cost that is there. Now, those are
Well, could you
obligations
just
that have to be.
hold that thought and just, if I could ask you, Tariq, to just repeat that point because I think it's worth really deliberating on. You're saying that the salary budget, the recurring budget, is the source of paying pensions at universities. That means that somebody who retired at whatever age they're retired at could be on the pension sort of books for, I mean, if someone lives to 95, 96, that's a 30-year period on which
Yeah,
they
you
are a
see,
burden on the
I mean, currently,
budget of the age.
currently, if you take all of the public sector universities, their budget would be about a bit under 200 billion rupees. Right? So, um, and of that, about 10 billion rupees is pension. Now, I don't have the exact numbers because in some they fund it through other things, but my estimate is about 10 to 12 billion rupees. We provide them 50 billion rupees. That means, roughly 20 to 25% of the money that the government provides goes into pensions. But as a total proportion of their entire budget is about 5 to 7%. But the main thing is, look, this is the cost that we incurred. We should have created a pension fund and paid it out of the pension fund. Because in the past, either they were mismanaged or because the funding was low, they began to eat into those pension funds. Those pension funds no longer exist. In some cases, they exist, but by and large, they don't exist. Just to feed the entire pension, if you look at it, 10 billion rupees a year, we need about 150, 160 billion rupees of a fund. We have about 35 to 40 billion rupees in the fund. So if we want to support it through a fund, we have a huge budget crisis, or we have to support it from the recurring budget. But the main thing, Musharraf, you have to understand is, if you want to run the universities, you have to pay the professors. You have to pay all of the costs that you have already incurred and haven't paid for, including the pension funds. It's simple mathematics. You have to do it. Now, of the total costs that we are paying out, the government is paying a rather small proportion, and that proportion has been going down. And that is also the smallest amount per student of any country in the world.
But that means that
the government is paying us 50,000 rupees per student per year.
Burden, right? That means that the student would be, if there's a decreasing share that the government is picking up, then that means that the students and parents and families are picking up the burden of years past.
Well, not only this, I mean, look, the way we have to look at it is that when right now what you're paying for, the students are paying only a part of it, because what we need to do in order to build the pension fund, we are not doing it, but we are actually paying out the pensions. Right now, we need to be doing the two tasks, building a pension fund and also paying the pensions. So it's not as if the students are paying more. The only way for the students to pay less, look at it this way, the only way for students to pay less is the government were to pay more.
Yep.
To cut down on the expenses is either to cut into quality or to cut into the amount of education. It's very simple. It's as simple as that. And it's not a point of view. It's simple arithmetic.
Yeah.
If it cost us, very competitively 170,000 rupees per student per year, and the government gives 50,000, then the students have to give 120,000. There's no other way around it. That 120,000 has to come from somewhere.
So now I'm sort of hoping against hope and reiterating my question. Are you hopeful? I mean, you've already said that this current funding situation is the worst that it's ever been. Are you hopeful that there'll be some relief upcoming in this budget, or are you expecting yet another hammer to fall?
No, we already know their indicative amount. It will be.
You're not allowed to say yet. Yeah, you're not allowed to say yet. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but obviously, whatever we have estimated to be our needs, the finance ministry is saying they cannot meet that. and that really will continue the crisis. It will deepen the crisis, if nothing else. So that is a rather unfortunate situation. I mean, but you see, the way I look at it is, if we have more money, we will use it effectively. But right now, what we have to do is to bring about the transformations that we can achieve with the money that we have, and that's what we are trying to do. And it's across a huge spectrum: education, research, the transformation of HEC, the transformation of the governing system in universities, the training systems, the testing systems, all of these, deployment of technology, bringing in online resources, enabling universities to use online resources more effectively, enabling professors to use it. All of these things need change, and we are moving in, across the entire spectrum of change that is needed.
And you're doing so in an environment and a context of fiscal and financial constraints that are growing rather than easing, at exactly the time where you need more money to help fuel some of the changes that you want to bring about.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Well, Tariq, I know that a lot of students will have watched this and will watch this, and I think a lot of people will be disappointed that there isn't more that they can sink their teeth into. But I think the purpose of this conversation was not to cater to the moment, but to help explain your vision for higher education in the country, the kinds of challenges you face, and what's coming up. And I guess in that way, it's been a very constructive conversation, because what's coming up, I think, is unfortunately a little bit more of the same as far as the financial situation is concerned, which means that you will need to continue, I think, or increase or enhance the degree of communication you have with the students, because I honestly believe that young people, as much as I might not be comfortable with Gen Z's wokeness or expressiveness, I think young people also are the most capable Pakistanis we've ever had, and so their ability to engage and understand is probably much underestimated. With that little bit of advice, I think we've gone and taken a lot of your time. Just wanted to leave it to you to say any closing, share any closing thoughts or words that you wanted to share.
Well, the one thing I do want to say is that this COVID situation is a national crisis, and I think our students can help us solve this. Online education is a part of the response to this. It has a lot of problems, and we need the students' help to solve this problem. I don't think that it should be seen as an us versus them idea. It's not a means of imposing anything on people. If somebody doesn't want it, they can opt out of it. Our idea is, it's a challenge, it's a crisis, and we need to face it together. And we need their help. We need the help of the students in transforming this.
Well, that I think will, inshallah, be forthcoming. I know that as I said, I think this is the greatest generation Pakistan has produced, the one that's coming up through the universities, and a lot is riding on them. Tariq, as always, a pleasure and a privilege to get to spend time with you. We were socially distant, so the masks don't matter. We're about 10 kilometers apart. But it didn't feel like it. It felt like you were right here, and
Yes.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you.